So as I was reading the commentaries for this week's gospel, I was reminded of a woman named Mary. No, not Mary, the mother of Jesus, but the Mary who we knew when we lived in Origsburg. When we joined Salem United Methodist Church, Mary was something of a fixture in the church. If I arrived for worship and Mary was already there, I could count on Mary extending her hand and offering a greeting and a boisterous good morning when her hand was extended. And Mary expected you to shake her hand back and offer her a good morning as well. And if you arrived before Mary got there, you could count on that greeting when Mary got there. Good morning! And you better be ready to shake her hand back. Now, Salem had 2 morning services, but the greeting would take place no matter the service, because Mary attended both. In fact, Salem also had an evening service. Mary attended that service as well. And Mary only had one thing different in the evening than in the morning. In the evening, when she stuck out her hand, it was, "Hello there!" And if you attended all 3 services, for whatever, which I had to do on occasion, you could count on the greeting all 3 times. And one of the hats I wore in my time at that Salem was serving as lay leader of the evening service. And even though it wasn't necessarily in the job description, I felt that as lay leader, I should be one of the last ones to leave at the end of the service. The service was held in our fellowship hall, and when it was over, we'd break down the tables and chairs and clean whatever dishes we use. And then once all that was done, I'd walk through the church and make sure all the doors were locked, lights turned off, that sort of thing. But other weeks, there was one other thing I would do. See, we had a message sign that we used to promote events taking place at the church. It was made of wood and hung from a post. You see it. Thank God Google Images took the picture the day the sign was hanging. It wasn't locked. You can see it's not locked, and it just hung free. When Mary left the evening service, she would check the message on the sign. And if the message was out of date, she would take the letters off the sign and bring them back into the church. I knew to wait for Mary to come back in. "Here, Mike, here's the letters from the sign," she would say, and I would stash them somewhere so the secretary would find them the next morning. Mary lived in a second-floor apartment on the main street in Origsburg. It would not be uncommon for Mary to be outside on a nice day talking with folks as they passed by. If I would drive by her during the day, Mary would wave, and I would wave back. If I was just going around the block and drove by her again 30 seconds later, Mary would wave again. And I had better wave back because she would hold me to task for that wave. See, in our language we use today, we might say Mary was special. But she did not allow that to stop her from using the gifts that God gave her. And when I was reading the commentaries, I couldn't help but wonder if today's parable would have ended differently if that third servant had known Mary. So we continue our 3-week journey through the 25th chapter of Matthew's Gospel. This week, the parable of the talents. Now, Peterson took some liberties in his translation, and talents became dollars. But in the original language, it's talents. And like the week before with the 10 bridesmaids, it helps to know some of the background information to understand what's going on. A talent in Jesus' time was a unit of money. Scholars tell us that that talent is the origin of our English word talent, which means a skill or something we're good at. But in Jesus' time, it was a unit of money. Now, Peterson said the first guy in the traditional text got 5 talents, got $5,000. Second guy got $2,000. Third guy got $1,000. A talent, depending on who you read, was worth either between 15 and 20 years' wages for the average worker. So when we're talking about a talent, we're talking about a considerable sum of money. So the guy that got 5 talents got somewhere between $75,000 and 100 years average wages for the average worker. So we're not talking about petty cash here. So the master's going away, and he summoned these three individuals. Now, Peterson referred to them as servants. Other translations refer to them as slaves, because the Greek word that was used here goes both ways. Some people translate that word servant. Some people translate the word slave. But what's interesting is what the master did was he called them in, gave them the 5, the 2, and the 1, based on their ability. If you read the Luke version of this parable, there's 10 servants. Each one is given the same amount. Matthew's version, the master looks at his servants and gave them the money according to their ability. Other translations of the word that we read as ability could be power or strength. So the master knew the skills and abilities of his people, and he gave them the money based on those abilities. Now, I don't know about you, but I take comfort in that. I take comfort in knowing that the expectations placed on me are based on my ability and my capabilities. As much as I may want to preach like Tracy Blackman or William Barber, it's highly unlikely it will ever happen. Nor, thankfully, is God expecting me to preach that way, because it is not in my ability. But what is interesting here is what the master did not tell these guys. He didn't tell them what to do with the money. He allowed them the latitude to take advantage of opportunities as they arose. It says he entrusted them with his money. Okay. Now, I'm not the only financial person sitting here this morning. I'm probably not the only person with investments or retirement accounts. How many of you turned your money over to a money manager and said, have at it? Just one? Two? Okay. Some of us might have said, here's my risk comfort level, and I don't want you to invest in this type of instruments, and I want you to stay away from these type of companies. Not this guy. Go for it, he said. So the servant who received the 5 talents and the servant who received the 2 talents get busy. Text tells us they traded them. Other translations say they worked them or labored with them. So now let's shift our context for a minute. Let's move back to today. When we trade or invest, we expect a return. And we know that when we trade or invest, there is also a risk. Okay. And the rule of thumb is the greater return, the greater the risk. See, even the college student picked up on that back there. She's doing good. So these 2 servants traded. They took risks. They didn't tuck the talents in a mattress. They didn't bury them anywhere. They took chances. Do you think they would have taken those chances if they feared the master's response, if the risks didn't pan out? See, I wish Jesus would have changed this parable a little bit. I wish there would have been a servant who said, you know what, Jesus, or you know what, Master? I took your talents and invested in high return bonds, a.k.a. junk bonds, and the market crashed. I would love to know what the master would have said then. The master gave him the latitude to take risks. He took the risks. He did what he thought was right. I'd love to know what the answer would have been. Sometimes, let's face it, when we take risks, they don't pan out. But one commentator said this parable celebrates active, forward-leaning, risk-taking, involved in the world where the rubber meets the road ministry. And we engage in that ministry knowing that sometimes the risks will make it so that we are not successful. When I was involved in Threshold at the federal prison, our goal was to make sure that when the inmates got out, they stayed out. But the reality is recidivism is a huge problem. So chances are that some of my efforts were not successful. But I used the talent I was given according to my ability. So the 5 and the 2 guys took risks because they trusted the master. If they believed they would have been punished for every mistake, it's highly unlikely they would have felt free to do what they did. They had confidence in themselves, but they also had confidence in the master in order to be willing to take those risks. So he returns and he settles up. The 5 and the 2 guys each doubled their talents. So one guy gives the master 10 talents and the other gives him 4 talents. And to each the master said the same thing. Well done, good and faithful servant. Now enter into the joy of your master. The 10 guy didn't get a different comment than the 4 guy. They both got the same comment. Well done, good and faithful servant. Now enter into the joy of your master. Then the servant who received the 1 talent reports to the master. Now, for whatever reason, he didn't have the same trust that the other 2. In fact, he was afraid of the master. So he buries the money. He's kind of like me sitting up here with that 1 quetzal. I get the sense, though, from how he started his report to the master, that he saw what happened with the other 2. He says, I knew you were a harsh man. So from his opening words, he's defending himself. He's trying to explain why he did what he did. I was afraid of you, so I hid your money in the ground. Here it is, safe and sound. In his comments on this text, David Lose said he often took the 3rd servant's assessment of the master at face value. And maybe he did that because of the master's reaction. Then Lose says us to focus instead on the trust shown by the first 2 servants and their response to that trust. And then see the master's response to the 3rd servant then through the anger or disappointment he felt in that servant for believing the way he did. The 3rd servant, Lose says, mischaracterized the master. But the master trusted him enough to give him between 15 and 20 years worth of the average wages of a working person. And for whatever reason, even though the other 2 guys had confidence in the master and faith in the master, for whatever reason, this guy did not. And he mischaracterized this man. So the master's not a happy camper. You thought about all those things about me, but you buried the money anyway? The least you should have done is taken it to the bankers so that it would have earned some interest. Makes sense for you and I, right? We don't bury money, we take it to the bank, what is it now, 0.0032 something that savings accounts pay or something ridiculous like that. I still remember the day when we were talking people out of 5.25% savings accounts because the return was too low. But in Jesus' time, it was a different story. In Jesus' time, it was not uncommon to bury treasure. It was an accepted practice, and according to rabbinical law, if you buried money and lost it, you couldn't be held accountable for it being lost. And even more interesting was the master's suggestion that the servant take the money to the bankers. Because in the Hebrew Bible, the law at the time, in at least 2 places, it prohibits lending money for interest. But the master trusted this servant. If he didn't trust him, he wouldn't have given him those 15 to 20 years worth of earnings to invest. But for whatever reason, this servant did not reciprocate that trust. The master wanted the servant to act boldly, take chances, step out in faith, but he did not. He buried what had been given to him and did nothing with it. Each of us, each and every one of us, has been entrusted with talents by Jesus. We call those talents time, talent, and treasure. Each of us has the same 24 hours in the day, but our talent and our treasure differ. That time, talent, and treasure are what Jesus gave us to use while Jesus is absent. What are we doing with it? How are we using our talents to build the kingdom? Are we taking risks? Are we acting boldly? Or are we playing it safe so we don't lose anything? Mary took risks. She stuck out her hand to everyone who walked into that church, and sometimes folks did not respond the way she wanted them to. I remember one day she started talking to me, and she said, "You know, Mike, I said good morning to so-and-so, and they just ignored me, and that hurt my feelings." September 13th, 2010 was a Monday. The reason why I remember it was a Monday is the subject of another sermon, but I know it was a Monday. I had a class that night. And when I got home from class and sat down at the kitchen table, Debbie came out to me and told me that Mary had died that day. Mary did not answer her door when someone came to pick her up for dinner, and the police found her still in her bed. As it happened, our pastor was away that week, and the other lay leaders and I, she went to all the services, agreed that we would share stories about Mary at her funeral. As part of that sermon I just mentioned that I'll preach some other time, I will share with you how Mary's funeral helped me through one of the most difficult times of my life. So the funeral was on Monday the 20th. The funeral home was a half block from the church. When it was my turn to speak, I shared the stories I shared earlier. Then I talked about Mary using the gifts God gave her to build the kingdom. And I looked out in the gathering at the funeral home, and I saw 3 women from our church who had recently been widowed. I said, in my mind, I see Mary arriving at the pearly gates, and there to greet her are Pablo, Clarence, and Galen. And as she emerges from the cloud, she sees them and extends her hand and says, "Good morning." And they reply, "Good morning, Mary. Jesus says to greet you. And he asks us to give you a message. Well done, good and faithful servant." I wonder if the servant who received the 1 talent had known Mary, if this story would have ended differently. Mary used the gifts God gave her. Mary took chances, and she did not play it safe. Mary was an example for the rest of us. Now, and you know how I said that the funeral home was a half block from the church? There's the funeral home. There's the church. As I was walking in the door to the funeral home, I glanced down at the sign. The message on the sign was out of date. My prayer is that each of us are trading and working our talents so that when the day comes, we hear, "Well done, good and faithful servant." Amen.